Rebecca had no clue why Gawain would be so interested in this problem. To her relief, it didn't look like her ancestor was about to give her yet another earful. I'm calculating and drawing at the same time. It will be much easier to treat the entire yard as a piece of paper. Gawain frowned. What do you mean? Rebecca pointed to one end of the yard. This side is a line, the other side is a parallel line. With those lines as reference, I'm treating the entire yard like a piece of paper. Every stroke of the magic circle is separated by points, and every point can be calculated proportionally with the distance between the sides of the yard as compared to the sketch. Gawain was dumbstruck. Complicated arithmetics were indeed a mage's expertise, but most regular mages couldn't do calculations like this. And right off the top of their heads. Gawain couldn't believe his ears. Rebecca was speaking in a way that even Heidi would not be able to understand. He, thankfully, did. So, you set up a coordinate system and used it as a foundation to scale the proportions of the magic circle accurately to the yard. Rebecca beamed. That's right! Gawain staggered back. This was arguably the most surprised he'd been since he climbed out of the coffin. It wasn't enough for Rebecca to come up with this idea. It required practiced geometry and rapid computational thinking. Especially in a world without a comprehensive mathematical system, Rebecca would have had to instinctively create her own formulas, and all in her head. Gawain knew methods on Earth that would make the process even faster, but so what? In this world and this era, Rebecca's abilities were the equivalent of Isaac Newton's findings during the Stone Age. Gawain studied Rebecca with a newfound respect. Did you think of this method yourself? Rebecca scratched her head. Not entirely. I read some of it on the rogue mage's notes. I filled in the blanks and thought since we're using his magic web, we might as well try his calculations too. This made a little more sense to Gawain. The rogue mage's notes had indeed been comprehensive in its geometrical calculations, but for Rebecca to have even extrapolated the mathematical knowledge and built off it to draw a magic circle of massive proportions was still breathtakingly impressive. Gawain nodded. Very good, Rebecca. Why bury the magic circle underground, though? The compliment emboldened Rebecca to give a more confident response. I thought that since this magic circle is primarily for the forge, they would do things differently from mages. During the process of moving materials or crafting things, they might destroy the magic circle if they're not careful. Also, burying the magic circle underground wouldn't affect its function and wouldn't affect future constructions on the surface. As long as the forge is within the range of the magic circle, it would be easy to add in new furnaces or to remove or modify the current furnaces. How should I say this? It is simply more convenient this way. Gawain's mind had a hodgepodge of words to ground Rebecca's logic in more technical terms. Form and factor, underground energy wiring, expansion opportunities, optimal energy consumption. But most important of all, Rebecca had considered that this magic circle was intended for normal people to use. She changed the design to allow it to be used in a safe setting. A typical mage would never consider a magic circle to be used by normal people. Though I suppose Rebecca was not a typical mage, she took 5 years to learn a single fireball spell after all. Gawain chuckled to himself and saw Heidi's puzzled expression. Dame Heidi, did you have similar considerations? Heidi shook her head. No, but I can understand Rebecca's line of thinking, even if it comes with certain downsides. Rebecca frowned. Such as? Heidi crossed her arms. Such as how we're going to monitor the magic circle if it's underground. If a fundamental symbol failed to work or if some burrowing animal messed it all up, how will we mend it? Rebecca lifted up a wooden stake. I plan on leaving more of these stakes around the yard. They'll be tied to a rope and eventually they will be replaced with mithril-plated rods. The bottom part will be in contact with the most crucial parts of the magic circle. They'll be able to help monitor if anything happens underneath. With mithril rods, the metal will turn black once no energy is coming from beneath. It may still be troublesome to dig up the yard to redraw part of the magic circle, but at least we won't have to dig up the entire yard. Even as she spoke, Rebecca patted a stack of paper and smiled. But don't worry, the magic circle isn't going to break down so easily. Lord Ancestor, please take a look. I rearranged the symbol's structure. Of course, I didn't change the fundamental parts, but I extended the symbols from the rogue mage's design. Gawain's eyes twitched looking at the wood stakes. Of course, primitive sensors. Rebecca smiled innocently. The efficiency should be slightly improved, and even if a part of a symbol is damaged, only the energy supply will be lowered. Finally realizing she had been speaking for quite some time now, Rebecca quieted. Her smile disappeared as she waited anxiously for Gawain and Heidi's approval. Gawain and Heidi shared a look. Then Gawain stepped forward and patted Heidi's head. "You're a genius, Rebecca." Rebecca stepped back so fast she nearly tripped. Gawain turned to Heidi. "Has no one ever noticed Rebecca's talents?" Heidi chose her words carefully. Her calculative abilities and imaginative ideas have always been her strong suit. But there's never been an opportunity to put those abilities to good use. The standard of a mage's strength has always been determined by spellcasting, and in this aspect she has always been at the bottom. Gawain sighed. Once again, the backward standards of this world gave him great dismay. Someone like Rebecca was a diamond in the rough. Naturally, in a world where technology does not facilitate society as a whole, it is extraordinary individuals who bring tremendous value to this world. Combat strength, magical spellcasting, enchanted weapons. These were the kinds of things that guaranteed survival and helped build a civilization. Gawain smiled to himself. The issue with valuing individual prowess is naturally the lack of emphasis on critical thinking and intelligence. These are things that can be taught, passed from one generation to the next. A knack for sword fighting and an affinity to spellcasting, meanwhile, could only hope to be inherited. Rebecca was an unconventional viscountess that everyone looked down on. She had been ostracized by the aristocratic community because she was a descendant of the Cecil clan. She had been scorned by the mage community because she couldn't even execute an illumination spell. She had been the topic of gossip for the merchants for being a terrible leader who issued bold and imaginative decrees, but was unable to make her territory or herself prosperous. But this was because no one could see her talents. Everyone dismissed her as weak and therefore useless. Calculations be damned, imaginative theories be damned. None of them meant anything if she could only wield a fireball. Gawain's smile spread wider. But everyone is wrong. A powerful mage needs no critical thinking. They simply solve every problem they encounter with magic. To power a forge, they wouldn't consider building a magic web. They wouldn't build it underground. They wouldn't need to map out coordinates. They would simply use sheer might to make it happen. Rebecca and Heidi were both mages who did not possess potent magical abilities, but made up for it with theoretical knowledge and creativity. And these were skills more important than the number of spells one could cast. Gawain looked up at the sky, at the giant sun owl. I'll prove to this world that mages like Heidi and Rebecca can stand alongside archmages and even elves. Gawain chuckled lightly and patted Rebecca's head some more. Rebecca, you are the pride of Cecil clan. Rebecca thought she heard wrong. Perhaps Lord Ancestor was employing sarcasm. In all 16 years of her life, the young Viscountess had never heard a word of praise. Throughout her childhood, she'd been called a nobody for lacking magical abilities. Thrust into a role of power as Lady of the Cecil clan, she'd been berated for lackluster policies and improper leadership. Yet here was her ancestor of however many generations ago, saying she was the pride of the Cecil clan. Gawain grinned, seeing Rebecca's surprise. Don't be startled. I'm praising you in earnest. Rebecca looked away bashfully. I'm only good at these trivial things. You wouldn't need any of this with a more exceptional mage. Gawain shook his head. Do not call this trivial, and from now on, do not consider yourself anything but an exceptional mage. The Grand Duke scrutinized Rebecca's modified magic circle some more. Though he was first and foremost a knight, Gawain Cecil was also something of a scholar himself. He studied magic circle theory before the Gondolian Empire fell, at a time when basic magic knowledge was more widespread. These new runes and symbols, I'm sure they will be feasible. Have you considered expanding it further? Rebecca blinked. Do you mean, draw it bigger? Gawain pointed to the edge of the magic circle. No, I'm asking if you could connect the design with other self-powered matrices, all connected together. I'm talking about a modular system that could power the entire land. Rebecca knit her brows. Heidi couldn't even pretend to understand. Gawain sighed. He looked to the White River. Let's say this one magic circle is a chunk of a river. If we build out more magic circles and connect them together, we can end up with one long chain that supplies the town with magical energy in the same way a river supplies all irrigable land with water. Does that make sense? Rebecca thought about it for a long while before looking up. I don't know. It's still a little hard for me to understand it. Gawain nodded. He knew he could not be too eager for a revolution in the field of magic. He turned back to Rebecca. That's all right. Let's focus on constructing this first magic web and getting the forge running. We'll touch on this in the future. Rebecca nodded with delight. Okay. I was also talking to Hummel about the possibility of designing a new kind of furnace. Gawain raised his eyebrow. Oh? Please tell me more. Rebecca shrugged. It came from the thought that if magic circles could fuel the furnaces properly, the way they were designed, or their workflow could be improved upon significantly. Gawain found the old blacksmith speaking to a couple of his apprentices. He called him over, and Hummel scurried next to Rebecca, his face beaded in perspiration, already dreading the outrageous demands the Duke may throw upon him. He had once heard of a viscountess in the north who demanded her golden fleece flowers blossom with 2 buds instead of 3. Her gardeners worked tirelessly to prune and shape the flowers, but even then it wasn't enough to satisfy the viscountess. Hummel knew dozens of stories about persnickety viscounts who gave impossible tasks to their people. Instead, Gawain pointed to Rebecca. Lady Rebecca was just telling me about your discussions to improve the furnace workflow. Tell me more about it. Hummel lowered his head and spoke humbly. I can't say, my lord. These things are designed in such a way that people like me will never truly understand. I merely know how to tend fires and shape metals, my lord. Gawain nodded. Of course. Magic is a foreign concept to most, but you have worked with the furnace and the anvil all your life. I want to hear what you think. I respect your opinion. Hummel wondered if this was a trap. The Duke respects my opinion? He thought he was hallucinating, but saw Gawain, Heidi and Rebecca all seriously waiting for his response. Hummel summoned the courage. If I had to say, I feel that since the furnace is going to use magic to increase the temperature, instead of just modifying the furnace, why not make a brand new kind of furnace? Now Gawain was curious. Brand new? Hummel gesticulated with his arms, trying to illustrate his idea in the most visual way possible. Since we are using magic, my lord, we no longer have to use runes. Without the limitations that runes put on the old furnaces, we can design them larger, allowing more metal to be smelt at once. And if what the Viscountess has told me is true, and the magic circle will power itself, we wouldn't need the furnace to cool off, which means we wouldn't need added effort and time to reheat the furnaces every day. Gawain nodded and let Hummel continue to speak his mind. Hummel started with stutters at first, but his experience kicked in. The nervousness left him as he saw Gawain listening with both ears. Of course. That would mean the furnace would have to keep running the entire time. Gawain responded with questions about smithing and smelting, and Hummel answered promptly, surprised each time at how much the Duke knew about the forge. He hadn't come to make unreasonable demands. He had actually come to discuss ideas, opinions, and improvements. By the time all of Gawain's questions had been answered, he took a step back and let out a light sigh. The old blacksmith grew nervous again. My lord? Gawain smiled at Hummel. How long have you been a blacksmith? Hummel replied quickly. About 30 years. People like us don't remember months and years very clearly. Gawain nodded and paced around the half-finished forge. A blacksmith with 30 years of experience. Usually, innovative ideas come from the young. How are you able to think of so many ideas? Hummel smiled bashfully. My lord, these thoughts did not appear only now like puffs of ash, They have accumulated over many years. My father, he used to be the village blacksmith and I, a mere apprentice. A knight once asked us to forge a batch of high-quality iron, and I volunteered to man the furnace. Seeing that I had been learning for so many years, my father allowed me to try. Hummel swallowed. But there was an incident. I was too hasty. And before the furnace had enough time to cool down, I reheated it and shattered the runes powering the furnace. The furnace was useless. I had never seen my father so disappointed. He locked me out of the smithy and spent the next 7 days and 7 nights inside cleaning up my mistake. Still, we were unable to meet the knight's order, and my father was beaten severely for it. Hummel hung his head, burdened by the memories. After all that, my father never looked me in the eyes again. He called out when it was time to eat, when it was time to work, when it was time to sleep. But he never looked me in the eye. Hummel sighed. He let the noises of the forge's construction calm him. When he spoke again, the old blacksmith had a melancholic smile. All that time I had started to think about furnaces, about fire and runes and magic, and what I would have done differently. He held his arms out, gesturing to the half-completed forge. And now, if you'll allow it, my lord, I would like to put some of my ideas to the test. With the help of the Viscountess's magic web, of course. Gawain placed a hand on Hummel's shoulder. Like metal shaped into a sword, your past has shaped you into the blacksmith you are now. Your ideas are sound, and I would be a fool not to let you try them out. With that, Hummel's heart swelled with hope. He had feared he would have to accept a duke's unreasonable demands. Yet it was in fact the duke who had accepted a mere old blacksmith's suggestions. Hummel bowed venerably to the lord. On behalf of my father, I will see that these furnaces burn day and night without fail. Rebecca's first magical web was a success. Luckily, the rogue mage had been using only the most basic of tools when he made the theory, so they didn't struggle to find supplies for this endeavour. As the resonators glowed, a smile played across the lips of Gawain and Heidi. Hers was one of surprise, and his was one of anticipation. They were both filled with pride. With the first success, Gawain turned to other matters. He went back to the giant tent in the centre of the camp, his mind abuzz with possibilities for the future. Betty the maid followed at his heels, ready to help in case he needed someone to send half-remembered messages or fetch him a snack. In Gawain's vision, the territory would first need to maintain a sufficient stock of steel. With enough steel, there would be weapons, equipment, tools for labour, and basic facilities to produce a higher grade of products. Construction of the smithing facility was only the first step. It was more important to complete the eastern mining area to ensure a constant supply of ores. Gawain stared over the map. He grunted and made a note on a piece of parchment to the side. The construction of the mining area would need even more materials. With the lack of heavy machinery, they could only rely on manpower to mine for ores. Thus, they needed more manpower. At the same time, they needed to upgrade the construction site in the camp as well. Their first step was to build wooden housing for the workers, although that was merely a first step. Gawain sighed. He wished they had time and stone masons to build proper housing, but they couldn't wish castles into existence. After all the problems were placed in front of his eyes, Gawain felt that building up from nothing was a very difficult task. With the treasure in the mountain, they didn't have to worry about funds, and they had the aid of Heidi's magic. But even with those advantages, building a civilization on empty land was a daunting task. Gawain sighed and grabbed a wooden mug filled with spring water that he kept to the side of his desk. He drank it down in one gulp. Betty picked it up and exited the tent to refill it. Gawain sat down. At this moment, he couldn't help but look forward to the aid that Francis II had promised. Not just the food and clothing, but also the 100 artisans and apprentices that would aid in their territory's beginning. 100 individuals. He didn't much care if Francis sent them the dregs of society, as long as they were talented in their crafts. After all, they had only 873 people there. An additional 100 hands would make a massive difference. It was a pity that at least 2 weeks were needed before they would arrive. Betty returned to the tent with a filled mug. Gawain drank some of it, and the maid sat on a cushion across from the desk. As he had been mulling over what they needed, it crossed Gawain's mind that Amber had been gone for 2 days, with no news. Surely she isn't so craven as to have absconded with 2 gold bars and disappeared. Gawain looked up. He chuckled to himself. Betty had started to doze off, her eyes rolling in the back of her head as she attempted to stay alert. He shook his head and returned his attention to his blueprints. He had been designing a new furnace, one that resembled a blast furnace on Earth, albeit with an entirely different mechanism in the center, one that left space for the magic circle, and was designed to avoid damaging the furnace's magical patterns. Unlike the magic web or the water wheel, Gawain had to combine his knowledge of both worlds in order to design this new furnace. Gawain knew clearly that only by completing the new furnace would it then be possible to realize all the bold and imaginative ideas in his mind. This was something that no one could help him with. He dipped his quill pen into the inkwell and began to scratch out details, labeling the parts of the furnace carefully. He had already completed the combustion chamber and molten iron drainage. According to Gawain Cecil's knowledge, a space for the magic circle had been properly reserved. Gawain rubbed his temple and reached out to the side. "Betty, would you mind bringing me the sheepskin bag by you?" No response. Gawain looked up. He shook his head, amused. The maid was now curled up on the cushion, snoring soundly. Her mop of yellow hair covered her face, and her hat had fallen to the floor. Gawain stood about to grab it himself, when Betty's head popped up. Her eyes were still mostly closed as she wobbled her way over to the corner of the tent, fetched the sheepskin bag and brought it toward him. A chuckle bubbled up inside Gawain. The maid had done the entire process without even opening her eyes. She then curled up on the cushion again. "If you're too tired, you can go to your tent. I don't know how much longer I'll be working on this." Betty sat up, her eyes suddenly wide open, as if she had been stung by a bee. "If my lord isn't sleeping, then neither will I." She then lowered her head and looked at the sketches on Gawain's table with a serious expression. Gawain examined her. "Can you read these?" Betty glanced up at him, then looked away embarrassed. "I can't read. Sir Philip says I'm illiterate." Gawain nodded. "Then I understand why you slept. It must be so boring to see your lord scratch nonsense on paper." "I wasn't asleep." Betty shook her head and rubbed her eyes. She seized her cap from the floor and placed it on her head. It was backwards, but she didn't notice. She put her chin in her hands and examined the drawings with even more rigor. But then she scrunched up her brows and shook her head. "You know, there are so many words." Gawain leaned back. He placed the quill back in its inkpot and folded his arms. "Do you wish to know how to read?" Betty nodded, then gasped and shook her head. She looked down and toyed nervously with the buttons of her dress. "Madam Hanson said that maids don't need to read. They only need to know how to work." Shaking his head, Gawain stood. "That is unreasonable. Everyone should learn to read. I can teach you." Betty's eyes widened with a mix of emotions. Gawain thought he glimpsed hope, excitement, and maybe a tinge of fear. "Sir Philip said these papers are precious and I shouldn't waste them." Gawain nodded. "He has a point. We need paper to record our progress and communicate with Tanzan Town." Then an idea occurred to him. "Wait here." He ran out and looked across the ground. He walked along, crouched low until he found what he was looking for, a broken tree branch, lying discarded. He picked it up and snapped off all the extraneous twigs. Gawain walked back to the tent, continuing to prune the branch. When he got back inside, Betty watched him curiously. Gawain picked a knife off his desk and shaved down the branch even further. Finally, he handed it to her. It was about twice the size of a pen, but sturdy enough for her purposes. "There. Until you're confident enough, you can use this to practice writing on the ground." Betty took the stick from him, befuddled. Gawain grabbed a piece of paper he had used before as a blueprint which hadn't worked out. He flipped the page over and scrawled on the back. When he was done, he handed the parchment to Betty. "There, that's the alphabet, and underneath is your name. Practice these characters. It's a good enough place to start. If you have any questions, don't be afraid to ask." Betty handled the paper like it was some precious treasure. Gawain moved aside one of the rugs that made up the floor of his tent. revealing the soft earth beneath. "There! You can use this dirt." He returned to his desk and Betty diligently began scratching away wobbly letters in the dirt. Gawain didn't hover over her but looked over every now and again. She seems diligent. Perhaps there's more to her than meets the eye. However, their peaceful working hour did not last long. After a moment, Gawain heard a commotion outside the tent. Betty looked up, fear freezing her expression. Gawain stood. "Don't worry, Betty. Continue your practice." Gawain picked up the sword of the founder from where it sat to the side in its scabbard and strode outside. The late evening sunset glinted off of a knight's armor. Gawain's eyes widened. Sir Byron was rushing toward the tent, his helmet in his hands, sweat glistening on his brow. "Sir Byron, what happened?" Sir Byron planted his feet before Gawain. "My lord, the soldier guarding the treasure vault just sent a report. They heard noise from within the mountain, something grinding on the wall or banging on it or something like that." Gawain gasped. It felt like lightning was singing the tips of his hair. "The treasure vault. Our clan's wealth," Sir Byron continued. "Since the vault is sealed, they could not investigate." Gawain nodded, sweat beading on his forehead. He breathed in and out and paced for a bit, his mind whirring with possibilities just on the clear side of panic. No use panicking, not until we know what we're dealing with. Sir Byron waited patiently for a moment. "My lord, should we send a scouting party at first light?" Gawain shook his head. "Our clan's fortune is in danger. I can't sleep." "Sir Byron, have Sir Philip see to the camp's defences tonight, and gather your most trusted soldiers. Fetch Dame Heidi as well. We need her magic too." Gawain fastened the sword of the founder to his belt. "We need to go back into the darkness." Gawain, Sir Byron, Dame Heidi and a group of soldiers arrived at the sentry post which stood just outside the treasure vault in the dark mountains. Gawain had had the temporary post built shortly after he and the others had first examined it, if only to keep an eye on things. But he certainly hadn't expected any trouble to come from within the vault itself. Once Gawain and his party arrived, they immediately saw by the firelight the 5 soldiers who were posted there to guard the vault. Each of the Clan Cecil bannermen had worried looks on their faces, but other than that, the situation appeared fairly normal. Dame Heidi and Gawain shared a worried look. Gawain had thought to bring Rebecca with them this time, but ultimately decided against it since she had been burning the candle at both ends with the magic circles. She needed her rest. Gawain, Sir Byron, Dame Heidi and the soldiers walked past the wooden sentry post and into the ancient ruins. The soldiers saluted them. One approached Gawain. He bowed respectfully. "My lord, since we dispatched the message from Sir Byron, we've heard another series of echoes from within the chamber. Twice." Gawain nodded. "Thank you, soldier. You may return to your post. I will take a look personally." He walked up to the door. Gawain spoke behind him. "Stand guard. No one is to enter without my orders." Holding a flaming torch in one hand, Gawain retrieved the platinum disc from his pocket. Gawain held the key up to the door. It glowed faintly, and the purple steel door sprung to life. It shifted and wobbled, transforming as if it were made of 1,000 individual doors, as opposed to the one massive door that it appeared to be. Heidi gasped, watching this display of magic for the first time. When the door finally stood open, Gawain turned to Heidi. "At least the magic channels are open. That means not too much has changed within." Heidi nodded, a glowing ice crystal forming on the top of her staff. She waved her hand and the ice arrow dissipated. Gawain gestured with his head to Heidi, Byron and the others. The party entered the darkness, their torches and Heidi's glowing staff casting flickering light into the gloom. As they entered the dark corridor, the magic crystals on the wall sprung to life, casting a consistent glow around the room. Gawain marvelled at metal ingots, armour and weapons, all lying in various places to the side of the entryway. They sat there just as he imagined. The magic light glinted off of each object in turn. Nothing had collapsed. Nothing seemed shifted, in fact. Everything was as he had found it the last time he was there. Gawain knit his brows, confused. If everything is as it was, then whence came that noise? So the group resolutely continued into the vault, Gawain examining every inch he could see. After a little while, Gawain stopped. Heidi stopped alongside him. She looked at him. "Lord Ancestor, what's the matter?" Gawain pointed forward. "Those doors! They were closed last time I was here." Dame Heidi looked up. 3 massive doors on the side of the hall hung upon. She felt a cold chill lace down her spine. "There's more in here besides the vault?" Gawain nodded. "Of course. These are Gondolian ruins, and they might run through the entire mountain for all I know." Heidi cocked her head. "Did you explore these 700 years ago?" Gawain clicked his tongue, his eyes still fixed upon the doors. "I did not. They were locked." Sir Byron's hand tightened on the hilt of the sword at his belt. His soldiers looked around nervously, wary of every shadow in every corner. Dame Heidi cautiously approached the nearest of these open doors. She whispered to herself and made a circular motion with her hand, dancing her fingers as if she was playing a quick tune on a harp. She gasped. "The magic seal here is beyond me. At least beyond what a level 3 mage can understand." Though he heeded her words, Gawain's mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about the sunspots from a few days ago, the red appearing on the sun, containing with it a burst of magic. Could that have unlocked the seals? It might be possible, but Gawain couldn't say for sure. Gawain led a few soldiers to those 3 doors. If this was a TV series, what would happen? He winced. If it was an American TV series, everyone who entered would die. If it was a Japanese TV series, then everyone would die because of a ghost. Probably the ghost of a sexy lady. If it were a Chinese TV show, well, then the ghost would do entirely different things to and with them. Gawain looked at everyone. They were heavily armed and armoured. No matter how he looked at it, this was an American TV series. We should seal these doors for now and explore when we can plan it out more. But he noticed Heidi had a distant look. Her staff was throbbing with light, and her hand was moving vaguely, as if she was listening to music no one else could hear. "Dame Heidi, what is it?" Heidi blinked and her trance was broken. "There seems to be some sort of magical response coming from beyond the doors." Gawain lifted his eyebrows. "A magical response?" She nodded. She gestured with her staff at the middle door of the 3. "It's coming from this door. I can vaguely feel something inside. It might be a magic circle or something that is circulating mana, but the response is very, very weak, and it is constantly weakening. It might completely vanish at any moment." Gawain swore to himself. So much for his impulse to investigate later. Humans in every world we court disaster. Gawain drew the sword of founders. The soldiers followed suit. Well, come on then. Thus, Gawain Cecil led the way into the blackness. Unlike the entrance hall, this new passageway had no illumination whatsoever. Dame Heidi whispered an incantation, and a glowing magical ball appeared at the top of her staff, casting a beam of light before them. The group gasped as they looked before them. The hallway was tall enough to ride a pair of elephants stacked on top of each other, and the ceilings were carved with sigils of religious significance long forgotten. Sir Byron shook his head in wonder. He let out a low whistle. "How big is this place?" Gawain shrugged. "It's from Gondolia's meteoric era, so only the gods know. They were capable of emptying an entire mountain for a stronghold." He swore to himself again. "If only Amber were here." Dame Heidi let out a surprised laugh and looked at her ancestor in surprise. "You think she would be useful in such a situation?" Gawain smirked. "If only so I could push her ahead of us to scout." Heidi's mouth dropped open, astonished at Gawain's cruel comment. Gawain chuckled, seeing her shocked expression. "Just a joke. It's mostly because of her shadow walk ability. It would be useful in a place with so many shadows." Heidi shook her head. "Oh, of course. I was confused at first." Sir Byron chimed in. "Our lord is a role model for knights and wouldn't do such a thing to a lady." Gawain raised his eyebrows inquisitively at Sir Byron. "Amber, a lady, I mean, Sir Byron. She does have some outward qualities of womanhood, but to call her a lady is definitely a stretch." Dame Heidi chuckled. "I'm not sure she even has those outward qualities of which you speak." The group chuckled a bit. Even though the jests weren't exceptionally funny, they all needed the levity to relieve the tension that each of them was feeling. But once their laughter faded, they looked at each other nervously. There was nothing for it. They had to keep walking. Dame Heidi's magic was enough to illuminate the halls around them. The lofty walls were all scrawled with runes and text. Heidi walked toward the wall and looked at the carvings. These don't appear consistent. There's some old Gondolian and some early modern Gondolian. Gawain walked up behind her. It makes sense. There should be at least 4 different languages on these walls, Heidi gasped. Of course, Gawain nodded. Now you're understanding. The meteoric era was Gondolia's great revolution. All of our languages come from the text along these walls. They proceeded further into the hall, following Dame Heidi and her sense of where the magic was coming from. Gawain, Sir Byron and the soldiers kept their blades drawn, just in case. As they advanced into the centre hallway, the group encountered plenty of forks, bends and stairs. They went deeper into the mountain and were constantly descending. They passed rooms that appeared to be audience chambers, dining halls, and others whose purpose had been lost to time. As they passed another dining hall, Heidi stopped by a door. She touched it and gasped. Gawain went up to her. "What is it?" She shook her head. "This isn't stone." Gawain looked up. The door appeared at a glance to be made from rock, but the intricate carvings on its surface would have caused most stones to splinter. "What do you think it is?" She shrugged. "I know not, but it seems man-made." Gawain licked his lips. If this was indeed made of some durable material, it might prove useful for their new land. Yet as they proceeded deeper into the mountain, past more halls and more rooms, there was one thing that wasn't there. Anything valuable, or any bodies. Whatever caused this underground castle to be abandoned did not take these people by surprise. The group didn't have time to explore each fork and room. Thus, Gawain could only order a marking made for the places they were unable to explore for now. In the future, when they had more manpower, they could more thoroughly explore the ruins. But for now, the group continued, led by Heidi's sense of the magical echo. An hour passed. The unending hallway seemed to stretch into infinity. The scale of this 1,000-year-old facility had already far surpassed Gawain's imagination. Even during the Gondolian Empire's prime, it was very rare for the Empire to construct a facility of this scale. Even if it had the dual functions of a military stronghold and research facility, Gawain found it impossible for it to be so vast. It seemed as though the entire mountain had been emptied out for construction. Up ahead, more stairs downward awaited them. Perhaps they were not inside the mountain anymore, but under it, in some labyrinthian network of passages. Gawain felt the magic in the dusty air, weakened after 1,000 years of dormancy. With multiple forks in the path and winding hallways, Heidi's grasp on the source weakened. She muttered divination spells under her breath to determine the rough direction. They stopped and turned around. Another dead end. Sir Byron made markings along the way, but he and the soldiers grew increasingly nervous navigating the ancient facility. As they retraced their steps to follow another fork down the never-ending corridors, Sir Byron walked up to Gawain. "My lord, if we head deeper we might get lost. Everyone is losing their sense of direction." Gawain frowned. He had been confident in everyone knowing their way back. "Of course, I have the benefit of the aerial view, and I remember every fork in the path we chose. I even have a rough sketch of the facility's map with the satellite memory. But now would probably not be a good time to reveal to everyone that I have a bird's-eye view of the world. They would think I found some mushrooms along the way." Gawain nodded. "Your concerns are reasonable, Sir Byron. We'll walk a little further and make a few markings. That way we can always continue at another time." Byron and the other soldiers took a sigh of relief. Even though it was an ambiguous promise, it was a promise nevertheless. Gawain and the rest ventured deeper. All the while he thought about Amber and how useful of a presence she'd be here. The bandit could scout ahead. She could run around with her shadow walk. She could lockpick and infiltrate anywhere she'd like, in the same way she had gone so deep in the Cecil clan ancestral tombs. A hall greeted down as they descended down a winding set of stairs. Obsidian cubes lined the chamber in an orderly fashion, like stone tablets leaning against the walls. Below the cubes, metallic ducts converged to the center, where a half-spherical device sat. Gawain walked to the device. He placed his hand gingerly on the surface, scraping off dust and oxidized substance. Underneath was a smooth silver. Heidi looked around the room at the cubes and ducts and the device. What is all this? Gawain searched his memories. It's something of a magic capacitor. Dame Heidi blinked. None of the soldiers understood either. Gawain once again used a term no one in this world would understand. He pointed to the obsidian cubes. Those blocks are linked to the facility's fount of magic. This half-spherical device gathers energy from the fount and produces a short burst of energy. Gawain pointed to a duct that extended from the device and stretched into a wall up ahead. The energy shoots through this duct to a specified location. Heidi's eyes widened. Is this a magical weapon, then? Gawain was quick to shut the idea down. No, this is a kind of subsidiary energy source for the research facility. During the meteoric era of the Gondolian Empire, magic wasn't just used for fighting. This facility was a shrine to research. Heidi knew this well. Mages and researchers were often titles that went hand in hand. It was seen as a mage's duty to study the rules of the runes, push the boundaries of magic, and solve the world's greatest mysteries. All this research was naturally a means to increase spellcasting power. Heidi guessed that this was not the kind of research Gawain spoke of. Sir Byron stopped next to her. Madame Heidi, is the magical aura coming from this place? Heidi concentrated for a moment and shook her head. No, but it's close, very close. Gawain gestured to one of the soldiers. Note down this place. This device is broken beyond repair, but the cubes and device can be broken down to give us around 1/2 ton of mithril and 7 to 8 tons of obsidian. The ducts also contain a large amount of adamantine, purple copper and purple steel. Heidi frowned. Lord Ancestor, you don't mean we're going to tear down this priceless device? Gawain stared back blankly. Why not? This device requires an extremely pure source of magic. We wouldn't be able to use it, plus it's been sitting in here for the last 1,000 years and has rotted to the core. Trying to repair it would be more costly than trying to build a new one. Heidi still seemed reluctant. But Lord Ancestor, to people like me, this is a valuable antique. Gawain sighed. No, this thing was an antique even before I died. Right now, to build out our territory, we don't need obsolete relics of the past. We need the metals. Heidi still agonized over the thought of breaking down this strange device, but she knew Gawain's mind had been made. Gawain walked along the main duct. The fact that there is a device like this here means the center of the research facility must be close. Let's go. Gawain activated his danger detection night skill, wary of possible magic traps. He thought of Amber, who believed there could be an abomination created by mages of days past. As they walked, Gawain looked to Heidi. I hear the knights referring you to Madame sometimes. Are you perhaps married, Heidi? Heidi smiled bitterly. I'm not. When I reached adulthood, I converted my religion to the magic goddess Milmina and gave up my right of inheritance. The inheritance was given to Rebecca's father. According to clan laws, adult women who had forsaken their right of inheritance due to religious conversion are all viewed as married, in the sense that they had devoted themselves to religion. Gawain nodded. Archived memories of the magic goddess Milmina popped up in his mind. She was known as the goddess of all magic, or more often than not, the mysterious lady. Those who worshipped her believed that she controlled all magic as the world's first giant dragon and first elf master mage. As such, the legendary dragon language magic and the current elf magic were purportedly created by her. Goddess Milmina did not have an official religion or church, as almost all those in the spellcasting professions were her believers, whether devout or not. Less than 1% of the mages officially converted their religion to this goddess. This was likely because mages generally did not believe in deities sculpting the world. Simple magic was a far better explanation. Seeing Heidi, Gawain was reminded of the Anzu royal clan's Princess Veronica. She converted to the Church of the Holy Light for the same reasons as Heidi. Heidi worried about Gawain's response. She didn't want to be scolded like Rebecca for being unmarried, or for forsaking her inheritance to follow the goddess of magic. Gawain just nodded. I see. And they walked on. At some point, the soldiers resigned themselves to the belief that they wouldn't be turning back, even if they still shivered with nervousness. The scale of the facility made everyone feel small. The thought that humans 1,000 years ago used to roam these same corridors and push the frontiers of magic made them feel like things had only gotten worse. Still, it seemed like they were getting closer. So they girded their loins and continued on after Heidi and Gawain. Heidi stopped. She felt it. The magical aura was right in front of her. "We're here." Heidi finally sensed that the magical power was right in front. Perhaps there was only one last intersection left. Meanwhile, after roughly estimating the distance that the party had covered and the terrain of the Dark Range in this area, Gawain believed this to be the center of the mountains. The Gondolian construction team must have really emptied a section of the mountains to build this facility. Everyone brimmed with curiosity. What exactly was here that was worth building such a massive facility? They were about to find out. Whatever spurred the researchers of Gondolia to build this mountain facility was the same reason they ultimately abandoned it. That was the thought that struck Gawain's mind as they approached the center of the gargantuan facility. Dame Heidi filled her ball of light with more luster. Gawain saw a straight corridor ahead made of grey stone slabs. Mounted on the walls were magic crystal lamps, all of them broken. Doors lined both sides of the corridor. Some were tightly shut. At the very end was a bronze door. Gawain took a tense step forward and squinted. Carved on the door, he saw the symbol of an eye, encased in a triangle. The door was ajar. Gawain activated his danger detection ability. He found no dangers or toxic gases ahead and relaxed a little. He took the lead, but Heidi tapped his shoulder. "Let me!" She closed her eyes and muttered an incantation. A purple rune in the shape of an eye appeared from her staff. The rune radiated a faint glow and drifted gently through the door. Heidi opened her eyes, her pupils giving off the same purple glow. She opened her mouth to speak but remained concentrated. "It's a circular room inside, empty. I see broken tables, shelves, pipes lining the walls. Tools and chains hang from the ceiling. At the center of the room is a pit. At the bottom of the pit, there's..." Heidi frowned. "There's something in the shape of a sphere. All of a sudden, Heidi let out a shriek. She staggered back. The purple dimmed from her eyes. Gawain grabbed Heidi before she could fall. "What happened?" Sir Byron and the soldiers braced themselves. All of their eyes peeled on the bronze door. Heidi's face reddened to the color of a cherry. I crashed into a wall." Gawain blinked. "Was it because you saw something dangerous or wandered into a trap?" Heidi shook her head. "It looks like a laboratory. A big one. There's equipment in there I've never seen before, and the magic aura. It's coming from the sphere in the center of the room. Being so close to it, it's definitely a kind of energy I've never come into contact with before." Gawain nodded. He, Sir Byron, and 2 soldiers heaved the heavy bronze door open. Even ajar, it was still cumbersome to push through. The rusted hinges creaked as Gawain pushed his body into the laboratory. Heidi turned around and looked down the dark corridor, fearing ancient monsters lurking. Awakened by the sound of the bronze door, none appeared. Gawain saw everything Heidi had reported. The circular hall, the damaged tables and shelves, the magical power ducts, and a pit at the center of the room. Gawain stepped closer to the pit and looked at the sphere, roughly 5 feet in diameter. Its surface was coarse and uneven, but otherwise a remarkably unremarkable ball. Though it looked like it was made of stone as Heidi neared with her glowing staff, Gawain caught a slight reflection. A type of metal, it seems. Still, it didn't look man-made, but it was far too round to be natural. The thing that struck Gawain the most was that it looked nothing like any kind of magical equipment that the Gondolian Empire had. Heidi scrutinized the ball closely too. "I don't see any runes or any source of magic to connect to. Yet, the magical aura I sense from it, it's quite distinct, like an energy wave." Gawain reached out to tap the sphere. It felt as sturdy as a boulder. Gawain looked around. Given the laboratory that was set up around the rock, perhaps it was something the mages of old were researching. Sir Byron couldn't believe his ears. This whole facility was built to study that. Gawain found it hard to believe too. Even as prosperous as the meteoric era was, To carve out an entire mountain and build a facility for a single sphere was a ridiculous proposition. Thousands upon thousands of people were needed for such an endeavour, and there was no crucial reason why it wouldn't make any sense. Gawain pointed all over. Look around! When this facility was abandoned, the researchers took everything that they needed. There is nothing left on the shelves. The halls and corridors we've scoured all emptied. They wouldn't leave the most important object behind. He looked back at the ball. This might have been something insignificant they were studying. Something they decided to give up on. Rather than dispose of it, they cast it aside here. Sir Byron gripped his sword, still vigilant. We've found the source of the magical aura. How do you propose we deal with it, my lord? Gawain nudged the ball a little, expecting it to be too heavy to carry out. But the sphere rolled out of position easily. Gawain's eyes widened. Such a large sphere was only about 20 pounds. Heidi tried pushing it too without a problem. Is it hollow inside? Gawain fought the urge to break it open. For now, at least. Let's bring this thing out and back to camp where we can properly study it. He paused. Actually, perhaps it's best not to put it in our camp. Let's find a leveled stretch of land next to the camp. Have 2 soldiers monitor the sphere and build a tent around it. They rolled the sphere on the way out. Gawain watched as the soldiers took turns pushing the 20 pounds of unidentifiable metal. He felt a little sheepish. These soldiers trained their lives for battle, for expeditions. Even now they embarked on a quest into an abandoned facility to uncover a magical relic 1,000 years old. And all it was a ball. It was as though a hero trained for years and gathered legendary armor and weapons and set off to fight the Demon King, only to find out the Demon King is SpongeBob. Why? Why were the people of Gondolia studying this ball? With Heidi's magic marks and Gawain's aerial view, they navigated out of the facility faster than they had ventured inside. The unbelievably light ball wasn't a burden. It thankfully didn't explode either. Finally, they exited the mountain. The soldiers breathed a sigh of relief. Their perilous journey into the labyrinthian corridors of the facility wasn't all for naught. It was all for a ball. The next day, everyone who lurked along the edge of the Cecil camp all saw the odd sphere. Soldiers busied themselves planting wooden stakes to partition the sphere away from the camp. Rebecca heard the news and rushed over to watch the fun. She nudged her way through to join Gawain and Aunt Heidi. Lord Ancestor, this is what you found in the remnants. Gawain nodded. We also found some extra metals to smelt, but it's just this thing that we can't figure out. Rebecca curiously circled the big ball twice. Can I touch it? Gawain waved his hand. Don't throw big fireballs at it. You're free to do anything else. Although this rock ball was strangely light, it was actually really solid. He had already tested it last night. Striking on the sphere with ordinary swords caused no damage. Gawain was less sure about throwing fireballs at it. Rebecca placed her ear on the surface of the sphere while tapping on it twice with her staff. It's not hollow! Gawain shrugged. Yet so unbelievably light. Your aunt scraped bits off it and found that it's a compound material with extremely high metal content. Rebecca looked deeply curious about the sphere. Perhaps the outer layer is only its shell and the inside is actually an extremely weightless material. Shall we cut it open and have a look? Gawain laughed. That was what I'd been planning on, but not now. We'll first use all sorts of methods that won't cause damage to study it. If we can't learn anything, then we'll consider cutting it open. The people of Gondolia back then had used so many tools to study it, but did not break its outer shell. There's probably a reason for that. Rebecca appeared to be slightly disappointed. Oh, okay. Gawain glanced at her with a smile. Compared to researching this ball, I have something else I would like to have you do if you have the time. Rebecca's eyes lit up instantly. Really? I'm not personally needed with the magic web for now. The craftsmen and apprentices are currently digging ditches to smelt quartz sand, so just tell me, what do you want me to do? Gawain chuckled. I'd like you to burn some rocks. Rebecca bowed to Gawain. Burn some rocks? Whatever you say, Lord Ancestor. She skipped off into the distance. She had no idea what her progenitor wanted to accomplish through this, but by now she knew that he often had hidden motives for what he was doing. Gawain watched Rebecca go without a second thought. He rubbed his chin. Everyone was uniquely gifted. He'd seen how readily Rebecca had jumped at completing fascinating tasks. If everyone in this fantastical world could be summarized in the stats of role-playing games, Rebecca was truly min-maxed. All her points were in imagination and mathematics. Everything else was a dump stat. At least her success with the first magic circle had proven that the teenage Viscountess really did know what she was doing in some places. With Rebecca gone, Gawain returned to the farm to survey progress. When he got there, he confirmed that workers had begun building the water wheel. It was still incomplete, but was a good start. After that, he took his blueprints and brought them to the smithy. Gawain found old Hummel standing around the old furnace, giving instructions to his pupils, who stood there in rapt attention. They all straightened their backs when they saw Gawain approach. He held out the large scroll to Hummel. "Here, for the furnace." The blacksmith's bushy eyebrows leapt up in surprise. He took the scroll from Gawain with a cautious air about him. Hummel knew that the Lord was concerned about the modern furnace, and he remembered that Gawain had gathered some opinions and suggestions regarding the production of modern furnaces from him a few days ago. He was skeptical, however. To him, Gawain was simply an aristocrat, a long-dead one at that, so how would he possibly know what was best for a furnace? Yet there he stood, handing Hummel a blueprint he had drawn up himself. Hummel unrolled the paper cautiously. His students clustered around him, but the old man barked at them and they averted their eyes. The blacksmith studied the blueprint, half deciphering the design and half figuring out what he should say aloud. If this great aristocrat, one used to living in castles and eating out of golden bowls, had designed this forge himself, it was possible that this design would be woefully inadequate. Hummel quietly made up his mind. If this furnace was useless, he must not reveal it. At worst, he would first agree, then work hard to build a furnace with a similar outer appearance, but entirely different on the inside. If the Lord were to discover anything fishy and questioned him, he'd claim that the illiterate apprentices and serf labourers were too stupid, that they could not build the new furnace properly. This thought lasted until he had a clear look at the blueprint. His eyes widened in surprise. Gawain grinned. He couldn't read Hummel's mind, but he sensed the trepidation melt away slowly. It was satisfying to see the old journeyman come across a new idea. He knew he was not a blacksmith in this life or the life he had led back on Earth. He hadn't thought to Google things about forging back when he had access to the internet, but he still had the memories of Gawain Cecil. The first Gawain Cecil was not a blacksmith, but the Duke of the East was, and an important piece of bragging material for the Duke of the East when he treated everyone to wine was his knowledge of smelting. Therefore, the Duke dragged Gawain Cecil to the furnace many times to practice his skill. He naturally knew what kind of structure a qualified furnace ought to have. With 2 layers of knowledge combined and suggestions from Rebecca and Heidi combined with a few hours of pulling his own hair out, drawing out a blueprint was at least possible. He broke the silence and spoke to old Hummel. "This blueprint is something I modified based on old furnaces of the Gondolian Empire, so it might not suit the current situation. It's just meant to give you ideas. Feel free to change it as you wish, as long as it suits our purpose." Hummel tore his eyes away from the paper. "Change it? No, this design is quite suitable in and of itself. So as long as we maintain a steady flow of ores and keep the slag clean from within, it can burn on." Gawain smiled and nodded. "That's right. Continuous smelting." Gawain cast his eye over the handful of pupils standing at attention. "But with this new strategy, I presume having only one blacksmith and a few apprentices would not suffice?" Hummel paused. He gritted his teeth, clearly distressed by this line of thought. Gawain put his hands on his hips, watching the old man come to terms with this. He spoke slowly, a current of nostalgia flowing through his words. "I suspect that we will need to rethink our way of working, much as my ancestors did before we established clanging smithies of old." Gawain walked over to Hummel and looked over at the blueprints. "Steel. Steel is the basis for everything. Of course we will need to work with all sorts of strange metal. But here, read this too." Gawain passed another sheet of paper to Hummel. The blacksmith took it and read. Unlike most members of their class, blacksmiths needed to be literate by necessity, so they could receive orders and interpret diagrams with written instructions. Hummel barely had to glance at the paper before doing a double take and looking up at Gawain in shock again. This bears no resemblance to a blacksmith's store. Gawain shook his head. It does not. This is Cecil's steelworks. For our expanding territory, we will need a large amount of steel, possibly more than you've ever seen in your entire life. This furnace and the magic circle were the foundation of this foundation. All of this is building for us to set a whole new series of production structures. As Hummel stared at Gawain's diagram, Gawain himself felt slightly uncertain. He was essentially trying to implement an industrial revolution all by himself. He had no idea what his attempts at a top-down reinvention of this world would look like. There were so many moving parts. He could be patient, but the gods of this world might not be so generous. As far as he was aware, while they were in the midst of building a civilization, it was entirely possible they could suddenly be beset upon by the dark wave and even a flood of aliens. They would have to press on regardless. Meanwhile, Hummel's eyes had grown distant. The old man was deep in thought. These new plans exceeded his worldview. In a production plant, he could not envision himself in the midst of the metalworks for the first time in his entire life. He shook his head, casting away the implications of his own obsolescence. Lord, if we really were to go according to your plan and had this many steel furnaces, how many blacksmiths would be enough? So far, I'm the only one we have. Gawain grunted. We will need to separate the processes of smelting the ores and processing the steel, but we will get to that later on. Gawain smirked at the smith. Did you think I was a fancy lord with a head full of naive notions about how all this worked, with no sight of practical reality? The blacksmith tensed. His apprentices all looked away, becoming very interested in the scenery around them. No, of course not, my lord. Gawain laughed and smacked Hummel playfully on the shoulder. Don't worry, if you did, that's normal. 90% of aristocrats in this era are that way, living in castles, their heads in the clouds, unaware of how grains are grown, how their gowns are woven, and how their metal is forged. Yet they love to order people like you around, don't they? Hummel's mouth hung open, poised to form a thought, but disoriented by the speech coming to him from Gawain. If a peasant said these exact words, they would be accused of committing treason. How could this lord from 700 years ago be this incisive in his evaluation of the aristocrats? Gawain grinned and stepped back. You must be wondering why I'm so critical of my own class. Very simple. I am Gawain Cecil. Back when I was a Grand Duke, we weren't living in castles. We hadn't built them yet. So I'm closer to people like you than those that bear my name or status now. Hummel closed his mouth. He stroked his beard anxiously with his old hands. Gawain nodded. Now it's your turn, Hummel. Time to build a forge. The old man nodded and turned to his apprentices. You heard the Grand Duke! Let's do it! The boys fell over each other, scrambling to get to their tools. Gawain smiled. He was thrilled that old Hummel was convinced by his rhetoric. The sound of tiny feet caught Gawain's ear. He turned to see Betty the maid sweating and panting near him. Lord! She wiped her brow and breathed heavily. Miss Amber is back. She's in your tent with... She paused, as if imagining something. With some sort of dirty old man? Amber walked back into the camp with wide eyes. Even though she had only been gone for a few days, she was astonished about how much the camp had grown since her departure. Where before there had only been tents, there were now rudimentary wooden cabins. There were now drying yards, work sheds, and warehouses distributed around various areas of the camp. A new sawmill had been built by the White River, close to a simple temporary pier. Firm roads connected the camp to the various facilities along its perimeter. This place had taken on the form of a permanent residence, beginning the transformation from camp to village. She let out a low whistle. Looks like that old fossil had some good ideas after all. She and her companion entered Gawain's tent. The only one they found there was that muddle-headed maid, who popped up, startled. You! She chirped and ran off. Amber looked at her friend and shrugged. Make yourself at home. The one who came with Amber took a seat in a chair. Amber wandered around the tent. Weird. My boss has worked out of this tent for a half-month. Now the carpenters and masons have their own houses, but the Grand Duke himself still wants to stay in a tent like a nomad. Weird. Aye, that is strange. All of a sudden, the thick portiere lifted and Gawain walked into the tent, bright sunlight silhouetting his 6'6" build. Amber and her companion jumped. Gawain regarded the person next to Amber cautiously. He was an old man wearing a dirty robe with frayed edges. He had a matted beard and wore a tattered grey beret on the top of his head, which barely kept the tangled forest of hair underneath from peeking out in seemingly impossible angles. Gawain didn't dare to wonder how long it had been since this man washed himself, though by all appearances, this man was as withered as an old man could be. His bright golden eyes shone out from behind the greying visage, and they darted around with an energy that Gawain wasn't used to seeing in such a wizened head. The man before him at least fulfilled Gawain's mental image of a druid, someone who had lived out of civilization for most of their life, with ancient knowledge ingrained in their mind. In another context, he might have been mistaken for a beggar, but who else in society was closer to nature? He nodded, satisfied for the moment. Welcome to Clan Cecil's lands. We have been waiting for a learned man like yourself for a long while. I'm Gawain Cecil. You should have heard of me. The old man smiled widely. Of course, your name is known to all in Loren. I am pleased to meet you and serve you and your family. The druid looked about. He rubbed his hands together in anticipation. Anyway, where can I find the antiques? Gawain cocked his head. Antiques? The old man nodded. Of course, the ones to be appraised. Gawain stared at the old man blankly. But I sent Amber to find a druid. The old man laughed disbelievingly. A druid? I thought I was here to appraise antiques. The two turned their heads slowly until they both looked at Amber. She had frozen in place. Gawain spoke slowly. Tell me, how did this half-elf put it across to you? The old man shrugged. She said she had dug up an old antique from 700 years ago. Gawain rushed over to Amber and seized her by the ear. The half-elf squealed and wriggled out of Gawain's grip. He lunged at her again, but she disappeared into the shadows. Gawain rushed over to the entrance to the tent. He remembered being in the shadow realm, and knew that Amber couldn't shadow walk through solid objects. He held out his hand and murmured a silent word. His night protective aura caused the air to ripple around him. He felt something bounce off of him and heard a squeal. Gawain grinned to himself. Though his body was not capable of magic, these simple knight's abilities were useful sometimes. Amber's body reappeared. She tumbled backward, rubbing her forehead. Gawain grabbed her ears again. Stop, stop, stop! That hurts! Let go, let go! What? Do you want an antique to let go? Gawain growled at his disgraceful assistant. I asked you to find me a druid, and you brought me an antiquarian. Amber waved her arms about. He is the druid. How would I know anything about antiques? She grunted and squirmed, but Gawain held her fast. I did casually mention that I'd dug out an ancient from 700 years ago, but I didn't think he'd misunderstood. The old man watched this farce before him with a baffled expression. He raised up a finger, putting the pieces together. Wait, does this mean that the antique from 700 years ago is Gawain Cecil himself? Amber squealed. Stop saying antique. He'll rip my ear off. I thought I told you he was resurrected, but I didn't ask you to appraise him. The old man chuckled. Then he laughed. He guffawed and doubled over in hysterics. Oh, that's good. I thought you'd robbed his tomb. How silly of me. Gawain froze. He and Amber looked at each other, Gawain glaring furiously, and Amber gritting her teeth in a sheepish grimace. Gawain slowly turned his head to the old man. So you're not a druid, then? The old man's laugh died down to a mere chuckle. Then his smile vanished entirely and he fixed Gawain with an unexpectedly serious look. I can be, if the terms are agreeable. Gawain's jaw dropped. Is there a can be for druids? He shook his head. Are you a druid or not? I need a druid to help this new territory's agriculture. The old hermit didn't say anything. He reached into his robe and walked over to the piece of ground that Betty had been scribbling on. He then pulled out a seed. The old man cracked a smile and dropped the seed onto the ground. He walked over to Gawain's table and picked up the Grand Duke's mug. He looked in it briefly, then walked back over to the seed. He poured out a small trickle of water onto the ground. With the seed watered, the old man set aside the mug and put his hands together. He muttered a few incantations. Unlike Heidi or Rebecca's magic, when the old man spoke, nothing glowed. Nothing looked like it was lit up by a light show. But outside the tent, Gawain heard the wind whistle through the air, as if it was responding to a call. Then, a small green sprout appeared. Gawain gasped. No plant could grow that fast, not without help. Amber strained against his grip on her ear. "Look! See, he is a druid! Now let me go, it hurts like hell!" Gawain let go of Amber and looked at this old man dumbfounded. "So you are a druid, and an antique appraiser too?" The druid chuckled. "I was a druid with the Forest Heart faction, in my younger days, but I also appraise antiques, none better than me in all the Southlands." Gawain laughed at the paradox. "So you study flowers, fishes, birds, insects, nature as a whole, and yet you also investigate old man-made objects. How do you reconcile with this state?" The druid shrugged. "Even a master of nature needs money sometimes, so I broadened my horizons. Also, if you need a chef, I am adept at making food as well." Gawain shook his head. They had a true multi-hyphenate on their hands. "And you'll tell a fortune for a price too, I'm sure." The old man flopped onto a cushion in the corner. "Depending on the price, I could learn fortune-telling in a pinch." Gawain stared at the tent's canvas ceiling. Of course this is the druid Amber brings. A jack of all trades, unreliable, yet definitely qualified. The half-elf cleared her throat in the corner. "Are you okay? I know he's a little weird, but hey, he's a real druid. I wasn't lying to you." Gawain nodded. "Yes, he's better than nothing." He straightened himself up. "Well, sir, we will pay. With remuneration, you will be Clan Cecil's official druid. Does that suit your terms?" The druid grinned. "Of course it does." They clasped arms. Gawain looked at the old man appraisingly. "What's your grade?" The druid adjusted his tattered robe. "Grade 3 druid, also grade 3 magic spell herbalist and a decent griller. Are you sure you don't need a cook?" Gawain laughed. "Of course not. We can't put Betty out of a job. She wouldn't know what to do with herself. We will provide the materials and tools to test your aptitude, and then we will pay you commensurately." The old man nodded. "Of course, I am but a seed, yet you will be astonished at how quickly I can grow for you." The shriveled old man smiled gleefully. This was the joy of a person who had finally escaped unemployment after starving for weeks. Even from a distance, Gawain could hear his stomach grumbling. The torn old robes, the ripped beret, and the untrimmed beard were not symptoms of a hermit lifestyle, but of outright destitution. Gawain pulled Amber aside and whispered, "Is he dependable, this acquaintance of yours?" Amber smiled. "Don't you worry. A horse may have kicked him in the head when he was small, but you've seen it. He's the real deal." Amber's smile curved up mischievously. "Or are you the kind of pompous aristocrat who judges people by their class?" Gawain sighed. Amber was getting too good at talking back. He pursed his lips in resignation. "How did you meet him?" If Gawain had to guess, there was a community of misfits all deemed disgraces to their kind, and that was where Amber and the druid met. The druid smiled and butted in. "My lord, I am an old acquaintance of Amber's adoptive father. I watched this little brat grow up. She ought to address me as uncle." Gawain marvelled at the druid's hearing as Amber rolled her eyes. "A fella like you wants me to call him uncle? Not a chance." Gawain remembered Amber speaking about her adoptive father, a human rogue who took her in. He guessed this bandit thought he could teach the little half-elf how to help him pickpockets. Amber pointed at the druid. "Back in those days, he wanted to team up with my father. They called themselves the Night Walkers and thought they could be the greatest bandits in all of the southern border." Amber burst out laughing. "They tried to steal cows from a farmer but got trampled on by bulls." Gawain frowned at the little old man. "You were once a bandit?" The druid waved his wrinkled hand. Bygone days, bygone days. It was a means to an end is all." Gawain chuckled. "You switched professions because you were a terrible bandit then?" Amber seemed to have more stories. He had no skills. When he failed at picking the pockets of merchants, he tried stealing from people who couldn't move, dead people. And he still got caught. He wasn't cut out to be a bandit. Of course, he's also not cut out to be a druid, or an antique appraiser, or a cook. Gawain was stunned. How do you get caught stealing from the dead? Amber shrugged. He had the great idea to steal during the funeral. The druid chuckled in embarrassment. Despite Amber's teasing and not-so-subtle disses, he simply laughed. He seemed to pay her words no mind, and truly regarded her as something of a niece. A bratty niece, of course. Gawain gasped. Right. I just realized. I still did not get your name. The druid held a hand to his chest and did an ambiguous salute. Lauren Pittman is glad to be at your service. You may just call me Pittman. Gawain nodded. Very well, Pittman. It's been a journey, I'm sure. I'll have someone bring you to your lodging. You've already gotten a good look. Everything is still in its early stages, so I apologize if the living conditions are not optimal. But if you work hard like my people, this place can be a comfortable new home for you. Pittman's face bloomed with a smile. I will do my best. As Pittman left with a soldier, Gawain turned around and caught Amber sneaking out. He grabbed her arm before she could slip out of the tent. Where do you think you're going? Amber struggled to free herself. I'm going to patrol the perimeters. Let go of me. Gawain wore a serious look on his face. First, explain what you mean by digging up an old antique with 700 years of history. Don't think I forgot you said that, Amber pouted. Progress in the camp was moving in the right direction, but not everything went without a hitch. In a courtyard on the western end of the workshop area, Rebecca stared blankly at the items before her. This is what Lord Ancestor wanted me to do. Burn some rocks? An odd-looking kiln stared back at her. It was made with fire-resistant bricks and mud mixed with quartz sand, like a huge bowl placed upside down on the ground. Drawn on the side of the bowl were runes to increase the temperature within. Flames blazed out of the kiln door as the workers pulled out oddly shaped rocks. More accurately, they were a mixture of limestone powder and clay. Gawain had said that these calcified rocks mixed with blacksmith slag would make a new kind of construction material. But to Rebecca, the rocks just looked like brittle lumps, like burnt feces. Rebecca followed Gawain's instructions, mashing and grinding the rocks and slag into a powder. She poured water from a bucket and waited for the mixture to soak up the liquid and harden. And what she was left with looked like grey, rotten wood. How could one build a house with this, let alone a doghouse? Soot covered Rebecca's face as she appraised her creations. Over the last week, I've either been here in the workshop or the forge assembling the magic web. Rebecca was familiar with soot. In recent years, her entire body would be covered in ash with the number of fireballs she practiced conjuring every day. Sometimes she fought dire wolves in the forest and returned covered in mud. The knights and soldiers were all used to this. The civilians who ran across her developed a quiet respect for the busy Viscountess. While Gawain was fair and benevolent, he came across as too authoritative to most people's liking. Heidi was intelligent and level-headed, but to many she appeared stern, as if silently judging every movement. Rebecca, on the other hand, never put on airs and greeted everyone with a cheerful smile, no matter how covered in soot she was. In a way, no one saw her as an aristocrat. She didn't garner respect, but she did not instill any sense of fear either. Rebecca sat alone with her thoughts. The assisting workers kept the flames in the kiln alive but did not disturb her. One of them shot another a look. They wanted to ask why the Grand Duke tasked them to bake rocks. It didn't make sense at all. Rebecca let out a sigh and waved her small hand. Bring these to the Grand Duke and have him take a look. Alone, Rebecca thought about the water wheel and the arrival of the druid. The camp was coming together nicely, all according to Gawain's plan. She and no one else could doubt him at this point. Rebecca pulled herself up and walked over to meet Gawain. Presented with the grey, rotten wood, Gawain frowned. This is the cement you made. Rebecca looked at the substance curiously. Oh, so this is called cement. What an odd name. Gawain crossed his arms. He didn't bother to tell his descendant that what she had created was decidedly not cement. Rebecca procured a porous dark rock from her basket, I mixed the rock and slag with water according to your instructions. It hardened quickly, and its appearance after was similar to stone, but it was actually soft and crisp. Amber snuck out from under a tent flap. Did you say soft and crispy? Let me have a taste. Gawain pushed Amber back into the shadows. Gawain turned back to Rebecca and looked at the blackened rocks. It seems like we've failed. He confirmed Rebecca's process over and over again, and concluded that she had not made a mistake following his instructions. Moreover, he'd even learned that Rebecca had specially adjusted the ratio of the various raw materials, the temperature of the fire, the baking times, and all sorts of other parameters. She used 4 furnaces and carried out several cross-tests. She even used limestone powder and clay of different consistencies and places of origin, yet the results were all nearly the same. Once again, this world presented a mystery to Gawain. How come cement cannot be made the same way here as it is made on Earth? Rebecca looked away as Gawain brainstormed different methods of making cement in his mind. Rather than worry about being reprimanded or scolded, she was simply disappointed in herself. Gawain caught the droopy expression and patted Rebecca's shoulder. This isn't your fault, Rebecca. You've done everything exactly as you should have. With this new material, we'll have to experiment some more. Continue baking with different proportions of limestone and clay. I'll give you a few more possible formulas. Treat this as a kind of research. We'll figure it out over time. Rebecca nodded, encouraged by her ancestor's words. On it, I'll do what I can. The first run at making cement had failed, but Gawain did not plan to give up. An inexpensive construction material like cement was too valuable to pass up, even if the formula is a little different here. Something about the properties of fire, water, and stone were different here. All they needed to do was figure that out. Rebecca ran off to try new methods. Gawain was certain cement existed in this world. The Gondolian Empire had used it, as was evident in the kind of materials present in the mountain facility. Much was lost after the fall of the Gondolian Empire. Without the azure fount and the seemingly infinite supply of magic, so many of the innovations of the meteoric era were lost. Over time, even the formula for cement was lost to time, and the people of Anzu reverted to using stone and timber to build houses. Aristocrats indulged in spells, potions, and blessings to embellish their castles. Gawain had different ideas. He wanted something inexpensive, something that could be mass-produced. Fragmented memories of concrete swirled in Gawain's head, from both his time as Gawain Cecil and as Gawain Gao. He had relayed it all to Rebecca. Whether or not concrete could be recreated now rested upon the fireball mage. Gawain sighed. If only the Gawain of old was less of a brutish knight and more of an intellectual. He returned to his writing, listing out further tasks to accomplish for the flourishing of the new Cecil territory. Over the next few days, Amber watched Gawain send for people to transport a huge pile of items into the tent. She saw jars of weird ore powder, metal containers connected together, crystal lenses of all sizes, and the magnets and metal wires that mages often used. The clutter of items covered his entire desk. A small portion of the items had been purchased from Tanzentown, and the rest had been made with Gawain guiding Heidi and the craftsman. Looking at the table full of things, the half-elf looked stupefied. "What are you making?" Gawain fiddled with a set of lenses in front of him. "I'm experimenting." As usual, Amber found aristocrats difficult to understand. Her eyes lit up. "Oh, you're just playing with toys to kill time then. Finally, you're starting to act more like a noble, wasting precious resources and exploiting your people for trivial matters." Gawain pulled on Amber's pointy ear. "Enough. You ought to be a little more like Rebecca." Amber grumbled. "It's your fault I'm just a bodyguard here. I'm a renowned bandit, you know. But you have me patrolling and watching you draw ugly sketches. You don't respect my profession at all." Gawain's face palmed. "You're not even as motivated as Betty is. She comes here to learn how to read every day after finishing her chores. Is getting you to learn simple mathematics that difficult?" Amber's expression changed on a dime. "Oh, so that little maidservant is learning how to write? No wonder she's always muttering to herself these days." Gawain waved a hand at Amber. "If you really have nothing else to do, go outside and play on your own. Do whatever you want, but don't steal, don't create trouble, and don't fight with other people. If you want to fight with the fish in the river, be my guest." Amber grinned and dashed into a plume of shadows. Alone, Gawain focused on his slapdash pile of items. Much of them he had already spent considerable time experimenting with. He sat back into his chair and glanced at the basket of Rebecca's failed cement. Rebecca wanted to throw it away, but Gawain kept it close to him. He let it serve as a reminder that this world was different from Earth, that there were still many things he did not yet understand about the planet. Gawain began to write. Year 735 of the Anzu calendar, day 46 of the frost month, 23rd day since the camp was pioneered. The creation of gunpowder has failed. A classic formula from my knowledge on Earth, as well as various formulas adjusted for magic, turned out to be ineffective. There is no similar product that can spark an instant flame and release a burst of heat in a short period of time. The completed product of the classic formula cannot be ignited at all. If we continue experimenting, we may discover a usable formula for gunpowder. But the vague realization that I'm slowly coming to is that this route may not be the best choice. The magical power of this world is more relevant, and we could probably make more progress with it. Researching an explosive rune that could be industrialized and mass-produced might be more dependable than gunpowder. Gawain sat back and swept his gaze across his other notes. He picked up another piece of paper and read his notes from yesterday. Year 735 of the Anzu calendar, day 45 of frost month, 22nd day since the camp was pioneered. I have confirmed that electromagnetic induction is ineffective, or at least the process of getting a magnetic field to produce electricity. No electric current was produced in the coil. It has been verified that magnets exist in the North and South poles, and their properties match those of Earth's magnetic field. The wind element runes that Heidi provided also picked up on the weakest of electromagnetic stimuli. The coils were coarse, but they should have generated electricity. I can only conclude that there is a problem with the electromagnetic induction itself. It still cannot be verified that the magnetic field is incapable of producing electricity, especially since Heidi's lightning arrow cannot provide a sustained and stable flow of electricity. It seems like the plan of using an electric generator to provide energy for the wind element rune has to be shelved, or we wait till we've grasped skills such as thermoelectricity or the likes of it. Similarly, I'm prepared to give up on the steam engine. The results of this experiment are simply too confusing. The process of boiling water in this world appears to be similar to that on Earth, but the energy generated by the vapor is terribly weak. Perhaps the degree of expansion when water becomes water vapor is much smaller than on Earth. I suspect the water here might not even be water. It might explain why concrete forms into a different material here. If it is not a hydrogen atom and two oxygen atoms, or if the bond is slightly different, it could also explain how the change from liquid to gaseous state is different too. Though I've been drinking the water here regularly, using it to wash my hands and face and watering the ground and flowers, this does not prove anything. My body is composed of the elements of this world. My senses are also working according to the rules of this world. Except for a consciousness in my head that is from another world, I have absolutely nothing that can step out of this world's environment to carry out observations. Perhaps the blue sky up above is not even really a blue sky. The color that I see is just what my eye interprets. Regardless, without consistent energy from steam, some of the most fundamental machinery in all of Earth cannot be reproduced here. Gawain sighed. He picked up another piece of paper. Year 735 of the Anzu calendar. Day 44 of the frost month. 21 days since the establishment of the new territory. Heidi has never heard of coal, neither has the druid Pitman. In reality, it seems there is also nothing of the sort even in Gawain Cecil's memories. The good news is that charcoal can still be produced by burning certain kinds of stones. I remember the Typhon Empire produced a kind of flammable substance. It is not coal but a white stone. It seems to be a type of seawater sediment. It is more flame-resistant than wood and is very difficult to ignite. Moreover, I heard that the burning is extremely unstable and the smell produced is also unpleasant. Only the poor use it for warmth. Also, damn it, gold here is actually a semiconductor, but pure silver does not conduct electricity. What the heck? What exactly is going on in this world? I need a team of researchers to come up with a periodic table for this world. Gawain sat back and sighed. The more he experimented with the world, the more he did not understand.